Okay, so you know how much we love to just really dig deep into these fascinating corners of the world, right?
Yeah, totally. And I think today's story is a perfect example of that, like a place that most people have probably never even heard of.
Right, exactly. It's one of those places that, it doesn't even really officially exist, but it has this rich history and these really compelling human stories attached to it.
It really makes you think about like what gets remembered and what gets forgotten, you know.
Absolutely. So today we're going to be doing a deep dive into Assyrian Lake, or Gyolaysor, as it's also known in Armenia. And we're basing this primarily on this article titled Life and Exile at Assyrian Lake.
Yeah, it's a great piece of investigative reporting, like
Yeah.
really combines like historical research with these on-the-ground interviews and personal accounts.
Yeah, I was really drawn to the way the author kind of weaves those different threads together. You get the historical context, but then you also hear these really intimate stories from people who are directly connected to this place.
Right, and that's what I think makes this so fascinating. It's not just like some abstract historical event. It's about real people and their lives and how they've been shaped by these larger forces.
Yeah, so our mission today is to try to understand, the intricate history of this village that officially doesn't exist, and the present day reality of the people who are still connected to it.
And the article really like touches on so many different themes, like displacement identity,
Yeah.
the lingering impacts of historical trauma.
Yeah, so many layers to unpack here. So let's start with the basics.
Yeah.
Where exactly is this Assyrian lake?
Okay, so picture this, right? You're in Armenia and you're up in these like really remote mountains within this protected area called the Khosrov National Nature Reserve.
Okay, already sounds pretty isolated.
Yeah, very much so. And
Well,
it's right near the border with Turkey, like a heavily guarded border.
so not exactly like a tourist destination.
No, not at all. The article mentions that like the roads to get there are really rough. You need like an older, sturdy vehicle just to even make the journey.
Wow, and what's the closest actual town or village to it?
The nearest officially recognized village is Verendreven, but even that is a considerable distance away.
It's just striking to me that, you have this place with this human history, a community with roots that's situated within a nature reserve, a place that's supposed to be about preserving the natural world.
Yeah, that's a really interesting tension right off the bat. It kind of makes you question like whose history is being prioritized, whose needs are being met.
And who are the people who are connected to this place? The article refers to them as Assyrians, but it also hints at a more complex identity.
Yeah, that's right. So Assyrian is like a broad term, but it encompasses a lot of internal diversity.
Okay, so can you break that down a bit more?
So historically, right, the indigenous people of these regions like northern Iraq, Syria, southeast Turkey, who spoke Aramaic, they were often identified by their specific religious affiliations.
Okay, so what were some of those affiliations?
So you had Chaldeans, Nestorians, Syriac Orthodox, and each of these groups is linked to like distinct church traditions and practices.
So even though they shared a common language and culture, these religious differences sometimes made it difficult to forge a unified identity.
Exactly. And there have been efforts over time to kind of create a more cohesive Assyrian or Aramean or Syriac identity.
Trying to emphasize the things they have in common.
Right, drawing on those shared linguistic roots and their connection to ancient Assyria. But it's an ongoing process.
And it's important to note that there's also a large global Assyrian diaspora, right?
The huge millions of people spread all over the world.
And the article talks about their concern for what's happening in their ancestral homelands, particularly with all the instability in Iraq and Syria in recent years.
Yeah, they feel very connected to what's happening there. And it's not just like a distant concern for them. It's part of a longer story of displacement and struggle.
Which brings us to a really tragic chapter in their history, the Sappho.
Right, the Sappho, which means the sword in Aramaic, this refers to the Assyrian genocide that took place during the Ottoman Empire.
And this happened around the same time as the Armenian genocide.
Exactly. It was all under the same regime, the Young Turks. And during this period, hundreds of thousands of Assyrians, Chaldeans, Syriacs were systematically killed.
It's just horrific to think about the scale of the violence and the trauma that it inflicted.
Absolutely. And, understanding the Sappho is really crucial to understanding the Assyrian experience of displacement and their fight for recognition that continues to this day.
And Armenia officially recognized the Sappho as an act of genocide in 2015, right?
They did, which was a really important step in terms of acknowledging the suffering of the Assyrian people.
But the article also brings in the perspective of an Assyrian activist who argues that the genocide is still ongoing in different forms in other regions.
Right, and that really highlights the ongoing sense of vulnerability and the deep historical trauma that many Assyrians feel.
So, given this history of persecution and displacement, how did a settlement like Gyolaysor even come to exist in this remote part of Armenia?
So the origins of Gyolaysor are tied to the expansion of the Russian Empire in the early 1800s.
Okay.
The village was first settled in the 1830s after Russia took control of territories from Qajar Persia, which is basically the area that makes up modern-day Armenia and Azerbaijan.
And the original settlers were Assyrians who had actually fought on the side of the Russians.
Exactly. And as a reward for their service, they were given permission to settle in these newly acquired lands by the Russian Empire.
So they were basically given this land as like a thank you for their military support.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as part of this integration into the Russian Empire, a lot of them had their surnames Russified.
What do you mean by Russified?
Like they adopted Russian-sounding endings to their names,
Hmm.
and some of them converted to Orthodox Christianity.
Wow, so their identities were being shaped by these larger geopolitical forces.
Absolutely, and the article makes a really interesting point that not all of the residents of Gyolaysor were actually from this initial wave of migration from Urmia.
Okay, so where did the others come from?
Some of them came from a region called Seri-Mahmudia in the Ottoman Empire, so what is now Turkey.
So there were multiple waves of migration happening.
Right, and each wave brought its own, unique cultural elements to the village. What's really cool is that the descendants of those Mahmudia settlers have actually preserved a distinct dialect of Assyrian Neo-Aramaic.
Oh, wow, a dialect that's basically vanished in their original homeland.
Exactly. It's like a living link to a lost world.
Yeah.
And the article tells this really fascinating story about the exodus from Mahmudia.
Yeah, I remember reading about that.
It involves this local Turkish aga, like a kind of feudal lord who wanted to marry a young Assyrian woman named Miriam.
And the villagers were obviously not okay with that.
Yeah, they were like, absolutely not. And the aga retaliated by basically bringing famine and disease upon the village as punishment.
So it was a very tense situation.
Very tense. And the villagers ended up assassinating the aga and then fleeing for their lives to Armenia.
Wow, that's intense.
Yeah, it was like a 200-mile journey. They traveled by foot and ox cart. It was brutal.
And they eventually ended up founding Gyolaysor.
They did. It's a testament to their resilience.
Mm.
Their willingness to risk everything to preserve their cultural integrity and their way of life.
And the article suggests that they might have chosen that specific location for Gyolaysor because it reminded them of their original villages.
Yeah, like maybe the landscape had a familiar feel to it, and it's something you see a lot in migration narratives, this desire to recreate a sense of home in a new environment.
Makes sense, but here's the thing. The article keeps saying that Gyolaysor doesn't officially exist.
Right, so it's not recognized on any maps, it doesn't have any official status, and because it's located within a national park, there are strict rules against any kind of construction or development.
So what does that actually mean for the people who are connected to it?
So today there are only about 14 people who live there, and they only come during the summer months.
Oh, wow. So it's not even a year-round settlement?
No, and the way they describe it is not to live, but to exist.
That sounds incredibly harsh.
Yeah, they don't have any basic utilities like gas or electricity. Their mobile phone service is spotty at best.
Yep.
You can only get reception in one specific location.
It's like they've been completely forgotten by the outside world.
Yeah, pretty much. And the article also talks about the ruins of the Marjavarjas church.
Which must be a pretty poignant sight.
Yeah, it's this reminder of the village's past. Their faith, their connection to this land, and even in historical records from the early 1900s, the church was known for being structurally unsound.
Yeah.
Its roof was prone to collapse.
So it's kind of been in a state of decay for a long time.
Yeah, and there's a cemetery next to the church with these traditional Armenian carved memorial stones called kachkars.
And some of these stones bear Assyrian names.
Right, which further emphasizes that long-standing Assyrian presence in the region.
And we get to hear from Sergei Tumasov, who's described as the self-declared village head.
Yeah, Sergei has a lot of memories of Gyolaysor, especially from the Soviet era.
What was the village like during that time?
Well, Sergei remembers it being a lot more vibrant. They had a shop, a hospital, a collective farm, even a school. Although he does talk about shortages, like sometimes they wouldn't have enough bread.
So it wasn't exactly a utopia.
No, but it was a functioning community.
Yeah.
And Sergei expresses a lot of sadness about the collapse of the Soviet Union and how that led to his children emigrating to Ukraine.
So there's a sense of loss there.
Definitely. And he believes that if they could restore the church, it would somehow revitalize the village.
Like, it would bring back a sense of hope and community.
Yeah, it's interesting how these physical symbols can hold so much meaning.
And then there's that striking image of the headless statue of Joseph Stalin.
Oh yeah, that's quite a sight, standing there in the former village square.
Headless and riddled with bullet holes.
Yeah, the story goes that a young Assyrian man beheaded it, and that Armenian militia used it for target practice.
It's like a physical manifestation of the complex and contradictory legacy of the Soviet era.
Absolutely, and the fact that it's still standing is kind of ironic, because Gyolaysor basically vanished from Soviet maps during the de-Stalinization period.
So no one bothered to remove it because officially the village didn't exist?
It's this bizarre consequence of bureaucratic erasure, and it makes you wonder, why was Gyolaysor abandoned in the first place?
So the article points to the late 1940s as the turning point, and it says that the collective farm was criticized by Soviet authorities as lacking perspective.
Lacking perspective. What a way to put it, right?
It sounds so clinical, like it's just a matter of efficiency, but it really masks this much deeper story of displacement and marginalization.
Yeah, and if you look at the broader context, 1949 was also the year of mass deportations of Soviet Assyrians to Siberia.
Where many of them died due to the harsh conditions.
Exactly. So you see this pattern of targeting certain communities and forcing them to relocate.
And this idea of lacking perspective, it just makes me think about how the Soviet Union often promoted this narrative of progress and development, especially in remote regions.
Yeah, you see it in films like Sulphur's Phoenicia, this idea that they were bringing modernization and prosperity to these far-flung corners of the empire.
But the reality for villages like Gyolaysor was quite different.
Yeah, they were deemed impractical or undesirable and just erased from the map.
And we see similar patterns of rural depopulation across Armenia and Georgia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, although for different reasons.
Right, those were driven more by economic factors and the lack of opportunities in rural areas.
And the story of Gyolaysor gets even more complex when you start to look at the interethnic dynamics.
Definitely. So historical records from the Tsarist era talk about the presence of Turkic ethnic groups in the village who were later classified as Azerbaijani by Soviet ethnographers.
And then in the late 20th century, you have these conflicts between Armenia and Azerbaijan, these forced migrations and population exchanges.
Right, and those events led to Armenia becoming a much more ethnically homogeneous country. And there's this Azerbaijani document that claims Gyolaysor was destroyed by Armenians.
So you have these competing narratives about what happened.
And it shows how history is often interpreted through these different national and ethnic lenses, which can make it really difficult to get to the truth.
And Syria also talks about the destruction of religious sites, both the mosque and the church.
Right, and that adds another layer of complexity to these interethnic tensions.
Then we hear from Razmik Khosrow, who was actually the last person born in Gyolaysor in 1949.
Razmik only has memories of losing the village. His family was resettled when he was very young.
So he never really got to experience life there.
No, and the article talks about his father's melancholic gaze towards Turkey, which suggests this deep longing for their ancestral homeland.
And there's this unconfirmed story that the village was actually razed to the ground on the day Razmik was born.
It's like this final act of erasure.
And ultimately, it seems that the establishment of the Khosrow National Park in 1958 was the final nail in the coffin for Gyolasor's official status.
Right, the park brought in these new regulations that restricted human habitation. The land was now designated for conservation, and that basically formalized the village's disappearance.
So it's this strange situation where a place with all this human history is now primarily seen as a habitat for wildlife.
And even the few people who still live there are sometimes viewed as like an invasive species.
It's a really thought-provoking way to end this part of the story.
It really highlights the complex interplay of history, politics, and environmental concerns.
The story of Assyrian Lake is this powerful reminder of how historical events like the Safo political decisions, even conservation efforts, can lead to the disappearance of entire communities.
And how these events can fragment identities and erase cultural heritage.
But it also shows the incredible resilience of the human spirit.
Those few individuals who still return to Gyolaysor each summer, they're a testament to the enduring power of place and memory.
And this deep dive really makes you wonder, how many other unofficial histories are out there? How many other communities have been forgotten or marginalized?
It's a reminder to look beyond the official narratives and to listen to the stories of those who have been silenced.
And those stories can give us a much richer understanding of the human experience, in all its complexity and beauty and tragedy.
Absolutely. And on that note, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.
Take care.